1 in 8 without food, unemployment at 10%, health and wealth inequality continuing to rise, and the richest Americans gain $340 billion in wealth. All that and more as Labor This Week begins now. Hello, I'm Mark Harrison. We begin with the new normal. And for many, it's not very good. Indeed, since federal aid disappeared last summer, an additional 8 million people have fallen into poverty in the United States, double the number prior to the start of the pandemic. New claims for state unemployment hover at or near 800,000 every week, and the unemployment rate remains around 10% a week, week over week. House Democrats have twice passed massive stimulus bills, and even the White House has encouraged going big with relief efforts to offset the rapid escalation in the numbers of those falling quickly into poverty, only to be rebuffed by an intransigent Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and his fellow Republican senators. Indeed, the new landscape for employment is finding many who thought they were temporarily furloughed now becoming permanently unemployed. 4.5 million workers who previously held jobs classified as permanent have now seen those jobs disappear, a number that has been steadily rising since April. And with no relief in sight for sectors most severely affected by the consequences of the pandemic, that number is expected to continue to rise for the foreseeable future. Now, the sobering fact is that the rise of permanent job losses has been the fastest on record. It has never happened so quickly, not even during the Great Depression. I'll be right back with a look at how these figures are affecting far too many Americans. As we find ourselves stubbornly stuck at 10% unemployment and with a dearth of good news about any form of a stimulus plan coming out of Washington, Americans from coast to coast are feeling the economic hopelessness that the COVID-19 pandemic has brought. Indeed, many who rent have been hit the hardest. The protections against evictions that had been instituted in the spring gave way to no protections over the summer, and many were forced from their homes with nowhere to go. Now, as of September 1st, the CDC instituted another ban on evictions, citing the spread of COVID-19, but that ban has been set to expire on January 1st, and not everyone will qualify for that exemption from eviction. And with evictions come empty apartments and landlords with lost income and problems of their own, and the dominoes continue to fall. Now, of great concern is the fact that homelessness among the elderly is on the rise. And despite decades of time to prepare for a known event, the policies coming out of Washington have never materialized. The aging of the American population is upon us, and the timing could not be worse as the pandemic ravages the economy. For many of those managing to stay in their houses and apartments, the question of what to pay when looms large as utility and water payments fall farther and farther behind. Many Americans are now rounding out a forgettable 2020 with no heat and no hot water. And this as the days become darker and colder. And without the pandemic, more children are not covered by health insurance, a number that has increased for the past 3 years. Add this figure now to the pandemic, and we find an America that cares very little about the health of its future generations. We'll be right back with some of the headlines. The Trump administration has stripped workplace protections from civil servants, making it easier to hire and fire those who work on policy. A move that takes protections from many career federal workers, with federal employee unions saying it is the biggest change in workplace protections in a century. And it has converted many federal workers to at-will employees. The move is widely thought to have been introduced to make it easier to fire policy workers who disagree with the president. A shocker, I know. Meanwhile, in a disgusting play of power in Washington and a demonstration of just how much Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell disdains people who aren't rich, he advised the White House that should the Republicans be asked by the president to pass a new stimulus bill, he'd be unable to guarantee the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court. this happen. I know she's been appointed. That's a very bold and swampy move that smacks of political blackmail, Senator. Terrible. In California, where the Uber and Lyft corporations have been fighting a state labor law that would require them to treat drivers as employees rather than as independent contractors, the State Court of Appeals has sided with a lower court holding that the companies must treat the drivers as employees. Now, both corporations have threatened to leave the state if they didn't get their way. Just going to take your ball and go home if the rules don't match with what you want to play. But just in time to add a little drama to the rift comes a California ballot issue that will allow voters to weigh in on Proposition 22, which would give drivers some of the benefits of being classified as employees, but not all. Stay tuned. We'll know more on that next week. Finally, new data from the Federal Reserve confirms what many of us already know, and that is that the COVID-19 pandemic has transferred immense wealth to the already wealthiest of our country. In fact, the 50 richest Americans are now worth as much as the poorest 165 million Americans. And those people aren't really poor, that whole 165 million group. Now that's up $339 billion so far in 2020. The rich get richer. I'll be right back with my thoughts on the upcoming election. Well, we're almost there. The relentless parade of political ads, punditry, polls, accusations, and the sheer ridiculousness of the drama that has been the 2020 election season is almost at an end, or at least in theory. For more than 5 years now, we here at TLN have been advocating for union workers and for workers everywhere. We have been reporting on legislative and judicial rulings that affect workers and unions, and we have been warning about the perils of income inequality and of wage stagnation, and suggesting that we are one crisis away from much of our society falling into a dystopian society. And if you have been paying attention to the stories we have been bringing you, you are well aware that over the past 4 years there has been very little positive news for most of our workforce. As of this broadcast, 1 in 8 Americans do not have enough food. Our elderly and our children increasingly find themselves falling deeper and deeper into poverty. Many Americans no longer have health insurance. Many of those are children. The Supreme Court added Justice Neil Gorsuch, and the powers of the Koch brothers and other right-leaning institutions quickly made Mark Janus a household name as right to work for public sector was revisited, and just like that, joining a public union was an option, and if you opted out, you didn't have to pay dues. A killer for public sector unions, potentially. Unemployment hovers at 10%. The economy is in tatters. Workers who were once snubbed as unskilled labor were rebranded as essential workers and sent off, in many cases across America, to face a deadly pandemic without personal protection equipment and no extra pay. 1 in 6 small businesses have said they will cease to exist if things don't get better before the end of the year. They won't. They're getting worse. And with those businesses, permanent jobs will cease to exist. Republican senators admit they are only interested in the opinions of the top earning 60% of their constituents. If you earn in the bottom 30%, your voice is meaningless to them. Of course, if you are participating in the stock market, you're doing pretty well. Very well over the past 4 years, in fact. And if you have paid a lot in income taxes, you were a billionaire or a major corporation, you also did well. So this is it. It's time. Time to accept where we are and continue on the path of the last 4 years, or to make a real change and meaningful change. It is now up to all of us to decide how we are going to move forward. It is up to all of us to exercise our most basic right as Americans and to cast our votes for the future of this country. Now, that's not a platitude. That's not a cliche. That's fact. The future of our country is at stake. Vote wisely next Tuesday. I'm Mark Harrison for later this week.